Hi, and welcome to Power of 10, a podcast about design operating at many levels, zooming out from thoughtful detail through to organisational transformation and onto changes in society and the world. My name's Andy Polaine. I am a service design and innovation consultant, design leadership coach, educator, and writer. My guest today is Alex Schmidt, author of Deliberate Intervention Using Policy and Design to Blunt the Harms of New Technology, recently published by Rosenfeld Media. Alex has pursued many interests in public service and design through different avenues over her career. As an award-winning reporter and producer for NPR and others, she covered arts, business, technology, and urban development. She's published work in The New Yorker, The Los Angeles Times, and her writing about UX, privacy, and other design topics has appeared in A List Apart and the Columbia Journalism Review. As a researcher, strategist, and UX designer, Alex has worked for both agencies and in the public sector. Her greatest interest lies in the wicked problems inherent in enterprise design and the mysterious ways of large systems. These are all areas she has delved into as a product strategist for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Alex, welcome to Power of 10.
It's so wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining. I know it's early morning for you to make my afternoon here.
Yes.
So, I mentioned the Federal Reserve, but your views are your own.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. I am not representing the Fed in this conversation. I won't really be talking about them. Just wanted to put that out there.
So, before we get started, and we're going to mostly talk about the book, I'm always interested to know, when I've read a little bit of it before there, your journey to kind of where you are now. I'm always fascinated to hear about what people thought they were going to be doing to what they ended up doing. So what's been your pathway?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I've overused that word in describing my writing of the book, but it also goes for my career because my undergraduate degree was in art history of all things. I was an arts reporter in the public radio world, as you mentioned in the intro. But I had always kind of had an interest in tech for a whole bunch of reasons. I went into the tech world, worked for big clients like Motorola, TLC, Verizon. And now I kind of consider myself being back in the public sector. You know, I sort of see journalism as the public sector. And now working for my nation's central bank, I consider myself to be back in the public sector. So, people sometimes say, oh, you were a journalist, now you're doing UX. And I think it's actually really a natural transition. I interviewed people as a journalist. I interview people as a researcher. So much of my work is about packaging ideas and selling them. And that was the case when I was a reporter, and it's the case now as a researcher.
So there's usually an itch that everyone's trying to scratch, or there's a kind of pressure cooker that goes on when someone writes a book about, there's some things I've been thinking about for a while, and I feel the need to get them out there. But I mean, it sounds ridiculous because so whilst we're recording now, because I don't know when this will quite come out, Twitter is currently in its sort of meltdown phase. There's just been all the tech layoffs. We're in mid-November in 2022. So it kind of seems like a stupid question in a sense, but I know that you would have been working on this for a while. So what was the genesis of this book? Why this book around using policy and design to blunt the harms of new technology?
Well, my initial interest actually goes back many years to when I was working for these large clients who I mentioned. I really got interested in the topic of privacy. And I see a lot of other design folks kind of try to sometimes use privacy as a way in to understanding what's wrong. And I kind of followed that pattern. I wrote a bunch about privacy, and I think it sort of has its limits when it comes to like explaining what's going on. And some years later, Lou Rosenfeld actually approached me and said, do you want to write a book about privacy? And I was like, no, I really don't. And I can go into why. But it took me about a year to come up with another frame, which ended up being about policy. And the reason I really wrote the book is because I wanted to kind of explore complicated questions that I had about how this all happens, like stuff gets designed, it goes out into the world, and then our society kind of responds to it. And that's really what I explored in the book. I didn't know the answer to that when I started writing it. I wrote the book because I wanted to explore those questions. So I think different from a lot of other Rosenfeld books, I wasn't writing it to share my expertise. I was writing it because I was confused.
I think it was you who wrote, or we talked about this in the sort of pre-chat, that you kind of don't really know what you're writing about until you're about halfway through it.
Exactly. Oh, no, until you're done, really. And actually...
until you're done. I think that's what you said.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the case for you, but, I've been like giving talks about the book and, having people are asking me questions and like my opinions are changing about it on a daily basis. I'm like, oh my goodness, like, there's this other dimension to it and there's this piece. And I think that's a good, like, fertile place to be, I guess. But like, you can't possibly put it all in. And of course, your opinions are going to change. And I don't know if you feel that way as a book writer, but yeah.
Well, when we wrote the service design book, kind of product design hadn't really happened. It came out in, I think, 2014, but we obviously were writing it before then. So by which I mean digital product design, as it's known now. So the whole product thing hadn't really kind of boomed. And so obviously now I think, I spend quite a lot of time talking about service design in the context of that context. And I guess the recent events in tech kind of more generally probably would have or may have changed your sort of lens through which you kind of look at this, because there's now a lot of massive government interest, and maybe we'll get to that in a minute. I'd like to go back a little bit actually, and sort of talk about the beginning of it, because when we talk about policy, now I've heard this phrase, and I think it's from a German philosopher, and I can't remember which one it is, that policy is the technology of bureaucracy. Can you talk about what is policy?
Yeah, so I'm going to, I have, of course I define it in the book, how could I not? Yes. So I'm actually looking for a quote that I have, which is, I don't even need to look it up because I think I basically remember, but the quote is something along the lines of, policy is an array of collective actions intended to design the world in which we want to live. So, and who are the like actors that, create those actions? It's not only government that creates policy. Usually three kind of actors are defined, which are government, so public sector, markets, private sector, and civil society, which is basically like a catch-all term for everything else. It can include, citizens, going on marches and nonprofits and whatever. So it's these three kind of actors that create policy about that end up creating the world we want to live, the world that we live in and the world that we want to live in. And my book focuses in on government policy and how that interacts with the private sector. But that is sort of the writ large definition of what policy is. I
sneakily searched for it whilst that was the Michael Walton
That's
quote,
right?
From Harvard Kennedy School. Mm-hmm. And there's actually a line that I had highlighted before, kind of just after this, which you said, policy is not something generated only by a government. It can be created or implemented by any of the policy actors above, the markets, government, civil society. But you go on to also say, it could be, refund policy. It could be about shaming others for not wearing masks during the pandemic, and of course of government policies as well. And I was kind of really interested in that sort of broader term of policy, because some of the stuff you're touching upon there is what would otherwise be talked about as kind of social conventions, right? Or social norms, I should think. That's probably maybe a better term. That those are in themselves policies, right?
Yeah, I suppose. Somebody shaming someone else for not wearing a mask doesn't think of themselves as, implementing a policy, obviously. But in this underlying idea that you're doing something that is hopefully resulting in the world in which you want to live, right? I think that's sort of the theme there. And so, in a way it is. But, the book doesn't really touch on like those ideas of, those things equating policy, but they certainly can be, I think another example, which is mentioned in the book about with civil society is, the activism of people who pushed in the U.S. for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, to basically modify all public spaces so that they were, accommodative of people with different physical abilities. And a lot of their work could be viewed as policy because they pushed for it to happen. I mean, and then government kind of, followed suit. But, these things all interact together and end up, creating the future, really.
So I teach a service design masters, and over my years, I've taught a lot of well-meaning design students who have wanted to, make the world a better place and on all of that stuff in whatever form it is. And it's changed over the years, actually. I say all of that stuff like sort of really glibly, but it's changed from sometimes it's been environmental concerns, then it's swung to kind of ethical concerns, or it's talked about marginalized communities and all of those things. And there is I'm going to be mean if any of my students are listening, there's sometimes a little bit of kind of eye rolling that happens among faculty when a student kind of has a project like this. Because on the one hand, yes, we want students to work on those and tackle those things because these are the issues of the future, the wicked problems of the future or in the past. But also they're sometimes fairly naively tackled from a design standpoint of like, well, if kind of, the shorthand is if designers ran the world, then everything would be fine, right? And for those not seeing Alex at the moment, she just did the eye roll that I often do. So, can you talk about the relationship between design and policy? And because you talk about also they have similar processes, but sort of different outcomes as well.
Oh my God, there's so much I could say right now. Maybe I'll start by just saying that I do think people in the design world have a bit of a savior complex. And it's sweet, right? Like it's a very nice, I know, like I'm being so, what's the word? Condescending. But it's very nice that, so many people in the design world want to, do good. But like you said, a lot of people who do design are in the private sector and they're inside of capitalism. And I think if there's maybe not one thing, but a major thing I want people to get out of this book is that that's okay. And, finding product market fit, which a lot of tech tries to do, is really hard and interesting. And, that's a good thing to focus on. But you kind of can't focus on policy and big picture societal changes that you want to bring about when you're trying to find product market fit. Mm. So I think that's kind of like the crux of it. It's like you're trying to figure out how some technology fits into society. If you're doing that, you can't also at the same time think about what is the final outcome of society later on down the line going to be and how do we need to react to this technology. They're really different lenses and different frames. And like one of the ways that I think about it is that design is kind of like at the level of the individual, whereas policy is at the level of society. Those are different and very complementary frames. And so I think if you are, designing at the level of the individual, again, I'm restating the same thing. You can't really at the same time think about the level of society. It's very hard. And again, that's okay. So I do think there's a lot of interesting things that designers can do to, lessen the harms of the things that they create. And I also think they can be involved like in the policy space, but I kind of see it as an extracurricular. It's like not maybe the main thing you're doing, but it's like a side thing that you're doing. Do you know what I mean? It's like not, it's like an area of interest that you can kind of work in, but it's not like your main design work.
So I guess, so from a service design perspective, I know my colleague where I teach, Sabina Junging, has written quite a lot about service design and public policy, would probably take a little bit of issue with that kind of definition of where you kind of place design. Because yes, I think traditionally you're right, the design, in design, I say design, I guess we're talking kind of human-centered design when we talk design here, and it does position itself as championing the user or the citizen, right? So it is down at that level. I think one of the things about service design and why this podcast is called Power of 10, actually, after the Eames film, is this idea of zooming in and out of different layers, right? So, even if we think of with inside an organization or a business, there's a lot of service design in public services. The interplay between how does a shift at that Zoom level, that sort of pestle Zoom level of political, economic, social, and all the rest of it, how, that ripple down into the individual touch points, the small things people design, and vice versa. How can one small change down that individual or kind of human level, touch point level, how can it make a difference? And this used to be, for me, this is a kind of fundamental skill of service design, is just be able to mentally zoom in and out of this and facilitate groups of people working on these things to do that too. Because I think a lot of the, so much misalignment comes from people talking at cross purposes, where someone's talking at the kind of big picture thing and someone else is getting really bogged in the detail or vice versa. For that, COVID was a gift, awful as that sounds. That I used to find it very, very hard to kind of explain that idea. But the idea now that a small thing, namely the virus, but even things like, social distancing, wearing masks, and a couple of other things, they would, they changed loads of touch points. Like I've got a picture somewhere of an ATM machine, which has just got a sheet of paper on it saying, out of use due to COVID, because you can't have people touching the screen, right? Right at the beginning of it, no one really knew what was going on. And so all these little things, they shut the world down for a year. And at the same time, obviously, government policy in different parts of the world, depending on those regulations, it had a ripple effect all the way down. So I kind of really like that as it's so useful to be able to kind of refer back to that. I don't know if it's fair to say that design sort of operates only at that individual level. And I guess after that little speech, my question to you really is, what do you think it is that designers should, if I'm reading your book, or what's the thing that they should really engage in that's perhaps a blind spot for a lot of design folks when they engage in this kind of work, when they're thinking about, hey, I feel I can use my design skills to, make the world a better place in some way or another at a kind of broader societal level. Where are they mostly sort of blind in your experience?
Well, let me just respond to what you're taking issue with, which I think is totally fair. And I think that, I should say I have a whole chapter of the book on what I call designing constrained spaces, policy constrained spaces, which is about designing in the healthcare, finance, and construction domains. So in those spaces, we understand a lot about the harms of those domains, right? We know a lot about fire codes, the fire codes that are needed. They're kind of the same around the world because we've figured it out, right? We know a lot about, electronic health record software, as kind of horrible as it is and annoying as it is, like it has a lot of policy baked into the interface because we understand the harms that can be created if like doctor-patient conversations don't go well, et cetera. So I do want to say that it's not exactly true that all designers aren't impacted by policy and don't need to think about policy. A lot of designers do, and they need to, right? So, what I was more referring to is more like emerging technology where we don't really understand the implications of it yet. That is very difficult to kind of design at the societal level that we're talking about, right? Once you're in a space like COVID is a great example of one of these domains where harms are more understood, which is healthcare, versus, something like facial recognition, where we're kind of still figuring it out. We don't exactly understand it. We don't know exactly what it's going to lead to. And so that I want to make that distinction. And it's not true that all designers don't design within bigger societal spheres. But to your question, which I think was
about their blind spot. So, there's a sense of kind of good intentions, the eye rolling kind of bit. And yet, obviously with that comes certain naivety as well, I think, and what their kind of blind spots might be. Yeah,
I mean, I think this is really, again, to go back to this idea that, designers shape the world and so do policymakers. That, I think, is like the big blind spot that I'm trying to kind of get across with this book is like, you're not doing it alone. There's other people who are thinking about this from another level. And perhaps it's worth thinking about that and considering how the policy sphere is also trying to shape the world. That's what the whole book is about. It's like, yep, you're doing design. It's great. And there's and you're shaping the future, and other people are also tasked with doing that from a different lens. That's really the blind spot that the book is about. And the book is like, I had to say many times writing this book that it's not a how-to. It's like more how to think, and hopefully how to think maybe leads to how-tos and stuff. But it's kind of, I don't know, like there's not that much writing that's like super similar to it. And so I see it maybe it'll lead to some interesting stuff. And people are like, hey, this is how I work with policymakers, or this is how I think about policy interacting with my work and all of that. So I don't have a checklist for designers to go through and be like, I did it, I did my good thing. And like, now I understand how policy interacts, whatever. But yeah.
Yeah, it was less, I guess the how-to than the blind spot. And I guess, in the other direction, what would you feel that, policymakers' blind spots are with regards to design? What is really what I'm asking here actually is, where do these two language groups struggle to understand each other at the beginning?
Great question. I think there's a lot, but one of the things that policy kind of doesn't always do well, or policymakers don't always do well, is they don't actually talk to users. And I think that's, one of the really obvious places where design is so important, is bringing it down, whatever, anecdotal stories you have to tell about how X impacts a person. So that's a big blind spot, I would say, for a lot of policymakers, not all. Another one is that, sometimes if policy is overly prescriptive about how something should be executed, it can be really harmful. And there's a great example in the book of designing for ballots for voting. Where, I believe it was Minnesota, their ballot system, somebody named Whitney Cusenberry, who's this amazing leader in the voting design space, let's say, they redesigned how ballots should be designed, but that then had to be written into law. So because it was the law was overly prescriptive and it led to a bad design, they then started with the design and said, actually, this works better. And now can you change the law so that it reflects this better design that we created? And so that's a good example of, maybe the people who were doing the voting system, they were following this prescriptive law, but it was like not actually leading to a good outcome. So I think overly prescriptive policy is like one place that, design can help. And so, those are just like a couple of examples.
Yeah, I think there's a quote about this idea of not just set a rule, and then enforce it, from government, but rather to think about how might government intervene. And I think that is this idea of, contained in there is that idea of kind of working out, well, what's the problem space, or what's the sort of behavioral context in which this thing is going to actually exist. And because you see often in public services, the thing that comes often up in service design projects is this idea of, basically translating a form into a workflow as a service, and where the history of forms, and Whitney would know about this obviously, used to be, we had a conversation, you go somewhere and you have a conversation with someone, immigration officer or whatever, when in the days when that used to be a conversation. And then that person would write stuff down and make some decisions, and you could kind of have a conversation. And then it got turned into a standardized form, and then those things went digital, and kind of not much has really changed in except that the relationship has got very asymmetrical, where it's just like, we demand all of this stuff from you, and you don't get to have a conversation anymore. And one of the things that happens in that is that there are all these little kind of blind alleys, like, oh, so you need your birth certificate in order to apply for this, that, and the other, right? And there was maybe some welfare support of some kind. But the reason why that person might be going on, need that support or that benefit, is because they live in an abusive household and they've left home or whatever, right? And so they cannot go and get their birth certificate, and all those kinds of things where you're kind of tracing these problems down. I think design's really obvious, but often overlooked by designers themselves. Their secret superpower is the ability to make something abstract tangible, right? To take an idea, and whether that's a sketch or whether that's a storyboard or whether that's just a thing where we can act that out, to actually understand how will this thing at this high level be implemented? What's the experience of this when we actually run this through? And you have a quote from Angelica Quixie, who's an ex-colleague of mine from Accenture Fjord days. And she said, she's got an urban planning background, but I don't think you can plan behind a desk. You need to go out and actually be familiar with, how it's implemented in situ. And that feels to me like one of the things that is the most important contributions that the designers can make. And it's actually kind of still fairly plainly designerly, I guess. And it's not so much about them trying to become sort of policymakers.
I definitely agree with you on that. And there's a whole chapter of the book on, design making policy making better. And I think that what you're saying, fits into that perfectly. If you wanted to kind of join the public sector as a designer and add your skills and expertise, I think it's needed and welcomed. Absolutely. Yeah. I think, just to reiterate, a lot of the book is written from the perspective of like designers in the private sector and how like the public sector interacts with that. But now we're talking about designers explicitly entering the public sector and helping make that process better. And there's so much need and there's such a place for that. So I absolutely agree with you.
There's another section of the book which is about policy design or it's enterprise design and the policy space. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think quite a lot of people, including me, so I mentioned Accenture before. Accenture is when I was there, it was like 550,000 people. I think they're like 700,000 people. So, the city I live in is 65,000. So you get the sense of the size of that as an organization. And, it's a classic, the brunt of many a joke about sort of enterprise policy and how hamstrung it is and everything. So could you talk a little bit about that section of the book?
That was a very cathartic chapter to write, I'll just say.
I can imagine.
Yeah. I do think when you sort of start getting into these bigger questions of like, how society is shaped and all of that, you inadvertently kind of enter enterprise, let's say. So you're in these spaces that are big, they're complex, they're often dealing with legacy systems, and there's a lot to think about and talk about when you're in those types of spaces. And I don't think a lot of design is well prepared, or many designers are not well prepared to help out in those spaces, unfortunately. And believe me, I'm Exhibit A, where I feel that I'm lacking certain skills and certain knowledge to do that better. And one example of that, I would say, and I don't even think this is in the book, this is something that I've thought about even more recently, which is that people design and like how teams are structured and roles and all of that is so critical. And I do not feel well prepared to opine on restructuring teams and roles and responsibilities, So, that's just one example of where I think a lot of design folks aren't super well prepared to deal in these big, messy, complex spaces. So
there's a thing that you talk about, which is sort of rethinking the metrics of that stuff in a situation where the users have no choice, right? So the stuff that we are, I guess we were talking about the difference between private and public sector. In public sector, obviously, as a citizen, I can't go to an alternative passport application office that is better than the one I have to go to, when I'm doing those kinds of things, nor can I decide to pay my taxes at a different tax department who's, offer more competitive rates and a better user experience, right? But the same is very true, obviously, with inside enterprise.
Yep.
So, you asked this question, I'm going to sort of ask it back to you, which is, how might we reimagine those metrics that value, say, user centricity when people have no choice to the tool in question?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm having a hard time with it. Believe me, I'm having a hard time with it. But I think some of the things that I talk about, where I sit is quality of insights. That's a metric that I sometimes talk about. Obviously, like efficiency, sure. Are you getting something done more quickly is something that is a good one to look at. Employee satisfaction, I don't know how much employers really care about that, but so it's tough though. Like, I don't really know the answer. Like somebody actually mentioned the example of like a McDonald's employee at the little console, checking people out with the software that they're using. Like, what are the metrics that those software designers use to see if it's like going well? Man, I'd love to know that. It's probably speed. It's probably speed, right?
It probably is speed and control and things. And I guess it brings me neatly on actually to a thing I wanted to talk about, because you talk about speed, and I talk about speed quite a lot in the beginning, about how the cycles of these things are very different. Can you talk to that a little bit? There's a I think a quote also from, I think it is from Whitney, isn't it? Queensbury.
Yeah, yep. So there's this idea of the pacing problem, which basically describes this idea that technology moves much faster than policy formation. And, I think there's some good reasons for that, and then some not as good reasons. A good reason is exactly what I said before, which is that it sometimes takes a while to understand the problems that technology is going to bring forth. Like, you don't always know when you put something out there what it's going to lead to, right? You actually need time to observe that and understand. You also don't even know which technology is going to have uptake by society, right? Like, there's all these experiments happening. Like, some get used, some don't, So like, policy needs time to observe the world and react, right? So I think there's some good reasons. There's also like not good reasons, which is like bureaucratic, lock where things just move slowly for not good reasons. It's like, when you see that stuff has happened, like, you should be able to respond to it in a nimble way. And we can't always, right? Because of a million gazillion red tape, hurdles that policymakers have to get through to try something. And it's hard to kind of create prototypes for policy and all that. And meanwhile, technology in the private sector is like putting stuff out all the time. So that's the essence of the pacing problem.
You talk about, you mentioned Donella Meadows a few times in the book, and obviously systems thinking throughout is a pretty major part. And one of the key ideas in there is this idea of delays, right? Of feedback loops and delays. And so this problem that I guess governments always have of, the problem with feedback loop and delay is this idea that by the time you have got the feedback about something and you start reacting to it, it's too late. And so you push perhaps too hard in one direction and you over-index. And so that's why you end up with those kind of sine wave like cycles of like almost everything. And, one of the things she mentions about GDP, actually, there's a quote in one of her books about GDP is a thing that has brought great quality of life as a kind of metric of how an organization is doing. And so there's this push, growth actually is what she's talking about, growth. And to a degree, but if we just keep growing, we obviously find ourselves in the situation we're currently in. I guess one of the things that is the design lesson from, say, Lean is this idea of shortening those cycles from putting a thing out there in the world and getting some feedback on it and then adjusting and putting things out in the world, and rather than taking the moonshot approach. And yet there are constraints on that, right? In the public sphere, sometimes it's about equity and equality in the sense that we can't sort of A/B test this because that would advantage or disadvantage a certain group of citizens, or that simply the scale of it prevents that from happening. Have you come across any good ways of addressing that?
The idea that that government can't respond in a nimble way, basically.
Well, how can you? And an experiment, I guess. How do governments experiment without causing harm?
I think there are some good examples of it. Actually, Well, I just attended the Rosenfeld Civic Design Conference last week and heard from some very interesting people in the public sector. And there was a woman in Israel who was talking about they wanted to do some interventions on cost of living problems, and they did a research project to find out what were the areas that were possible to intervene on. And they ended up honing in on, where the cost of food was one. There was another one that was this, whatever. And they ended up intervening on after-school activities because they actually felt like they could do something there. And they did pilots around the city that, included putting, playgrounds in certain places, providing, after-school things here, there, whatever it was, right? And they were able to, nimbly do a pilot of this intervention on this root cause of problems with cost of living. And I mean, there are ways to do it. Do you know what I mean? But I think you do have to have a leader. It's dependent a lot on that. Who's the person, who's your stakeholder, and are they willing to push and believe in you and let you kind of try a thing? So I do think it sometimes comes down to that, unfortunately. But it's not impossible, it's totally possible. Of course, it has to be done in an equitable way. Like all design, you have to think about, where do you put these interventions? What parts of the city are they going in? How do you make sure that it's distributed evenly? Of course, that's part of it. But I think it's something that can be done.
There's a very nice quote, and I might read the whole thing actually, from Charles Lindblom, from The Science of Muddling Through, where he says, making policy is at best a very rough process. Neither social scientists nor politicians nor public administrators yet know enough about the social world to avoid repeated error in predicting the consequences of policy moves. A wise policymaker consequently expects that their policies will achieve only a part of what they hope, and at the same time will produce unanticipated consequences they would have preferred to avoid. If they proceed through a succession of incremental changes, they avoid serious, lasting mistakes. This, for me, feels like it's set against the context of either the genius billionaire, supposed, or the kind of genius visionary politician. Feels like this is just a massive contrast, right? Because certainly in the sort of political environment, the idea of, I've got an idea for something and we're going to try it out, and then we're going to reflect on that and go, oh, that bit didn't work and that bit did work. That's just not in the political language at all. I never hear world leaders talking in that way, and yet they so should.
Yes. You're so right. You're so right. You're so right. And, perhaps I do think, okay, one of the things about, design and the public sector is that a lot of design that we are aware of originated in the private sector. And I think a lot of the wisdom of lean and UX and agile is just starting to trickle into these perhaps darker, trickier corners of society. And as sad as it is, but it's the reality, it is newer. And perhaps with some time, you will see that actually bear fruit. I obviously not talking about where I work, but this is true across the public sector. It's newer. So I wouldn't say like they're just stuck in their old ways. They are, but change is happening, and I do think, again, to come back to this idea that there's a place for design in the public sector explicitly, they know they need to change, and that at least is a thing, so maybe they haven't changed yet, but a lot of them know that they need to.
Someone once said to me, I've completely forgotten who it was actually, but ages ago, there's a phrase though that stuck with me, which was a guy called Simon Penny actually in Australia. And he said about interdisciplinarity is really about deep professional humility. This idea that you absolutely have to be prepared to go to the other person's profession with great humility, like I have no idea how you do what you do. And the both sides then find each other and find a third way that way. Because it feels to me, if we took the tech industry, the other end of taking ages to make decisions and so forth is obviously move fast and break things, right? or just break things if you're Elon. And you've got this, both sides acknowledge the fact that you break things, but obviously the scale of, initially the scale of harm is at the governmental level was perceived to be far greater than, a tech startup making mistakes. Now we know that's not the case. The scale of harm can be vast on both sides. But it feels like there's the language around speed is problematic there, that there's a kind of move just fast enough to carefully possibly break some stuff, but know how to undo it if you can. There's a middle language there that I feel is missing.
I love that. I really resonate with so much of what you just said, and I completely agree. And I kind of wish I'd put some of that in my book, but it's sort of there's a point when I say make reactive policy as proactive as possible.
Yeah.
Because policy is kind of by nature reactive for the reasons that I talked about before. But it can be better, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely, it can be better. Do we want it to move fast and break things like Meta? No, we don't. We do want it to be somewhat deliberative and thoughtful, but it can be better.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I wish I'd put this in the book. There's always a thing, as you said, you find out at the end what it is you're writing about. And then, of course, it's too late to do sort of massive changes to it. And then it goes out in the world. It becomes its own thing. So is there any parts of this that you wish you had put in? And what's been the reception like? What's been the reaction to it like?
I mentioned this to you when we chatted before, but there's this idea of if you fundamentally modify the nature of how things are built, at a more fundamental level, maybe even than design folks operate at, that then has real consequences. So great example. So I touch on this in the book, but not in any great deal, is what's happening with Twitter and Mastodon, right? And this idea that if you get back to sort of a fundamental decentralized configuration of, in this case, our public square, where we talk and communicate, that is going to lead to all of these outcomes, such as people not being jerks online and, negative things not taking on virality in the same way. So there's that idea, that it's even it's sort of outside what I even wrote about in the book. But I think that that's really interesting. And I do think that there's a lot to explore there, and there's going to be more to explore there going forward. And I could say more, but I'll just there's a lot of other things that I didn't do that I maybe wish I had done. But that's one. That's just one.
And have you been pleased or surprised by any reactions to it?
Well, I don't have that many examples of reactions to it. I have the Amazon reviews, and I have questions that people have asked me at conferences. I could honestly die happy based on the Amazon reviews. I really so relieved, because I don't know how you feel, but I was like, does this book suck? Up until, I still kind of wonder, I don't really know. And so people saying that they got anything out of it is like I said before, I could die happy. I do think that this idea that my book is not a how-to, a lot of folks in the design world, not in an explicit way that's conscious, but is problematic, and I think that, like I mentioned, I spoke at a conference, last week with a lot of design professionals, and they wanted better takeaways than I provided. And I understand why. I think I would be annoyed too. You're saying all these problems, you're not telling me what to do about it, blah, 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 blah. So I
would argue that's part of the problem though, right?
What do you mean?
You're taking, these are wicked problems. These are not things that are easily solvable with a set of kind of takeaways. Yeah. That's the whole point. Right?
I know.
This isn't something you can just, that there's a new tech that's going to fix this for us.
Right.
It never does. It always makes things just more complex.
Right.
or that it's simple. Otherwise, they would have been done. Right?
Exactly.
And I think that's if I was to argue about what the blind spot there is, is this idea of design seeing the world as just a set of solutions that need to be problems that need to be solved, and then we're done. Hugh W. wrote a nice piece about this the other day. That we just need to work out what the problems are and then solve them. So what's the framework for this? And we'll just go off and do it. If it was that easy, it wouldn't be so messy.
You're
it's
right.
a sensibility.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. And so, you know what? Never mind. I did okay. I don't know. But
I'm sure you did.
I really do think, just to come back to this idea, it's sort of, I do see it a little bit as an opening salvo. And I do think there's things designers can do, but I couldn't get that far because it's it was so hard to write this book as it was, and, there's more ideas that I came up with, why don't designers focus in on one known harm? That's not something we know a lot of the harms right now, abuse online, harms of bias, harms of autonomy, all of this stuff. Why are people talking about ethics when we already know the problems? So I think ethics is a lot about preventing new problems, and it's we already know a lot of the problems. So why don't you focus in on one of those? So anyways, I have there's sort of things that have sort of popped to mind that I'm I didn't put in the book, and I maybe could have.
I think what designers, certainly design students, but designers of lots of different levels of experience find with that is that stuff very quickly goes out of their domain or sphere of influence. Right, so some of the things we were talking about the sort of structural differences between, say, Twitter and Mastodon, or the original sin of the internet, that there was no micropayments built in, and therefore advertising became the dominant thing. That these aren't just they're not just design problems, right? Designers, I think, do absolutely need to be aware of those, but then also the collaboration is the most important thing. And I think one of the things that people can really take away from your book, from both sides, is this idea of, hey, here's how both these sides think. If whichever side of this you're on, you can and should work together.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said.
So we're coming up to time. Where can the first thing is, as you know, the podcast named after this Ray Charles Eames film about the relative size of things in the universe, and that's where the whole kind of zooming in and out of levels comes from. So the question I ask every guest is, what one small thing do you think has been either overlooked or under-designed that would make a outsized difference to the world?
My answer to your very great question is double the number of women's restroom stalls to the number of men restroom stalls. Because I am so sick of being oppressed by the number of restroom stalls. It's just unbelievable to me that this is still the world we live in, where women wait in these insane lines to use the bathroom. It should be at least double the number in every building. How is this not a thing? Oh my God. Okay, so that's my answer.
Architects.
I know.
So there's an episode of Power of 10 with my friend Chris Hayward, who is an anthropologist, proper ethnographer, and works in design. And he worked with some architects about this, actually, and had this exact question for them, which was, why have you just got the same number of toilets for men and women? Because when I go to the airport, I see these huge lines, and it's just, and that's one of those policy things. It's kind of like in the spec. It's just, that's just, how the building was designed. And it's a kind of a shrug of, that's just kind of how it is. And yet, as of course you know, if it was the other way around, if men had to wait a long time, that would be a solved thing already.
No doubt.
That's a great one. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad to know that other people are thinking about it. I did not know that other people have been thinking about it, and I'm glad to know that. It just, occurred to me because, and I think a lot of women don't even stop to say, hey, this is messed up. A lot of women are just like, this is just the way it is. We take longer, and it's no, it doesn't have to be that way.
Imagine where you were getting your coffee and they said, okay, you need to join the women's line. It takes twice as long.
Right.
You'd never,
Absolutely.
It'd be a lawsuit straight away.
Absolutely.
So listen, where can people find you online?
Well, Mastodon, I do have a Mastodon account, but I've barely been using it. I don't know. I guess for now, stick with Twitter, because at least I'll kind of reroute people to where if I go somewhere else, which is I'm at Alex Schmidt. I'm on LinkedIn. The book you can buy at the Rosenfeld Media website, or you can get it on Amazon, of course. And those are the main places, I would say.
And you're at the more formal alexanderschmidt.com too.
Oh yes, I have a personal website.
You have a website.
alexandraschmidt.com. Yep.
God, how quaint.
How quaint.
A website.
Right. Who goes to those?
They're going to be all the rage all over again.
I know.
Thank you so much for being my guest on Power of 10.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
As I'm sure you're aware, you've been listening to Power of 10. My name is Andy Polaine. You can find me at Polaine on Twitter or Polaine.com, where you can find more episodes and sign up for my newsletter, Doctor's Note. If you like the show, please take a moment to give it a rating on iTunes. It really helps others find us. And as always, get in touch if you have any comments, feedback or suggestions for guests. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening and see you next time.